Born into disadvantage the moment you're a girl in the ancient world. The first injustice a woman faced began not in adulthood, not in adolescence, but in the very moment she emerged from the womb. To be born female was to be born into disappointments. Subtle, sometimes openly declared with sighs and silence. And in too many cases, that disappointment was deadly. In cultures spanning from ancient Rome to rural China, and from the stone houses of Mesopotamia to the mountain villages of India, the birth of a girl was often treated not with celebration, but with dread. A boy meant lineage, labor, and strength. A girl meant dowry, vulnerability, and dependence. And so many girls never even made it past their first breath. Infanticide, particularly female infanticide, was a practice that curled around the edges of ancient civilization, like smoke unspoken, but present. In ancient Greece, it was not uncommon for a father to inspect his newborn and decide whether to keep it or leave it exposed on the hillside. The philosopher Aristotle, whose writings influenced Western thought for centuries, argued that deformed or excessive children should be disposed of by the state, and who were considered excessive, often simply girls. In ancient Rome, a law-abiding father had the legal right to accept or reject any newborn. Daughters were frequently exposed, left to die by exposure to the elements or to be picked up by strangers and enslaved. It's hard to overstate the casual nature of this cruelty. It wasn't always carried out with hatred. It was done with resignation, almost routine. Families struggling to survive couldn't afford the burden of an extra mouth to feed, especially one that wouldn't carry on the family name or be allowed to own property or take a job in those fields. The girl child was seen not as a future contributor, but as a future cost. Her life trajectory, shaped from the cradle, be confined within walls of homes, of social expectation, of silence. If she survived infancy, a girl entered early childhood, living the shadow of these expectations. Boys might learn to read or train for civic duty or war, depending on their class. Girls were often kept close to home, taught to obey, to serve, to remain unseen. In ancient Athens, girls were rarely educated beyond the bare essentials. Their education was in managing a household, obeying a husband, and bearing sons. In rural, agrarian societies, a daughter might help with the animals or the field work, but she was also watched carefully, preserved like a future offering to another man's family. Her virginity was her value. Her freedom was an illusion. Even her name told part of the story. In many ancient cultures, women's names were not recorded in official documents. On gravestones, in marriage contracts, or even in court records, they were daughter of so-and-so or wife of so-and-so, never fully themselves. The act of being named was an assertion of identity, and for many women in ancient times, that identity was denied at the most basic level. You were your father's girl until you became your husband's woman. In between, you were a problem. To be managed. In some places like Sparta, girls were given a little more leeway, but even then, the liberties were tied directly to the state's desire to produce strong warriors. The Spartan girl might exercise and run and train like her brothers, but her destiny was still defined by her uterus. She was to bear sons, and if she did, she was praised. If she didn't, she was seen as a failure, regardless of her own health or wishes. The worth of a woman was always conditional, tied to the needs of the men around her, never her own desires or choices. In ancient China, the idea of filial piety shaped every family structure. A daughter was expected to obey her father absolutely until marriage, and then to transfer that loyalty to her husband. The philosopher Confucius emphasized social order and hierarchy, which reinforced the idea that women must remain obedient and subordinate. A girl's feet might be bound to keep them small and delicate, a painful and crippling practice that endured for centuries, not just to please aesthetics, but to ensure her dependency. She could not run, she could not work, she could only exist in beauty and fragility, like a possession kept on a shelf. The inequalities began young and were reinforced daily. If food was scarce, boys ate first. If medicine was limited, boys received it. Girls were taught to speak softly, to not interrupt, to defer in all things. In many cultures, including the early Hebrew, Hindu, and Islamic societies, laws and religious codes cemented the idea that a woman's voice was lesser. Testimony in court from a woman might not be valid. Public speaking was discouraged or even forbidden. The idea that a girl might have her own opinions or ambitions was not just discouraged, it was considered dangerous. Even in the home, the supposed domain of the woman, the girl was not given authority. She might help cook or sew, but decisions were made by the father. The mother was often too bound by her own chains to intervene. Generations of silent women passed down the rules of survival, how to avoid punishment, how to obey without question, how to endure. And so the cycle continued. Girls were sometimes married before their first menstruation. As young as 10 or 11, they were handed off in arranged marriages to much older men. In such systems, the girl child became a wife before she had become a woman. She was expected to bear children as soon as possible, often before her body was fully developed, which led to high rates of maternal mortality and deformity. Her life became centered around others. First her father, then her husband, and finally her sons. The weight of expectation and limitation began the moment she opened her eyes. And from that point onward, the world conspired to keep them closed. To dream of more was a kind of rebellion. To speak it aloud, dangerous. In many ancient societies, a woman's curiosity was compared to Eve's sin in the garden destructive. Tempting and best kept locked away. And so the girl born into ancient times carried not just her own small weight, but the burden of countless generations of rules, fears, and enforced silence. She was not raised to thrive. She was raised to endure. And if she managed to survive childhood, her trials had only just begun, because in the ancient world, to be born a woman was not just an accident of biology. It was, by almost every societal measure, a sentence. Not a death sentence, perhaps, but a lifelong punishment nonetheless. No name, no rights, legally invisible to understand the true scale of how women were treated in ancient times. One only needs to look at how they appeared, or rather didn't appear, in the laws and legal systems that governed those societies. In a world dominated by written codes, scrolls, tablets, and carved proclamations, the absence of women's voices, names, and rights wasn't a coincidence. It was a feature, a design, a clear signal that a woman's role was never to participate, only to obey. In many ancient societies, a woman was not considered a full legal person. She was often classified alongside children, slaves, and the mentally unfit. She could not own property independently in most cases. She could not sign contracts without a male guardian's approval. She could not testify in court with equal weight to a man. In some regions, her testimony wasn't even admissible at all, no matter how intelligent, honest, or capable she may have been. A woman's legal identity was either erased or fused so tightly to her nearest male relative that she was little more than an extension of him. Take, for example, the laws of ancient Rome. Under the Roman legal system, women lived under a form of guardianship called tutela. This meant that for most of their lives, Roman women were under the legal control of a man, either their father, husband, or a designated male guardian. Even elite women, the wives of senators or emperors, had no independent legal authority. They couldn't vote. They couldn't hold political office. They couldn't even conduct simple transactions without male oversight, unless they were widows of a certain age. And even then, loopholes and restrictions remained. Their lives were managed like a state's property to be transferred, protected, and, when necessary, punished. In ancient Greece, particularly in Athens, the situation was no better. Athenian democracy, the proud foundation of Western political philosophy, was built entirely by and for men. Women were excluded from the democratic process entirely. They couldn't attend the assembly, speak at public gatherings, or participate in decisions that affected their own lives. Legally, they were considered minors for their entire lives. An Athenian woman's life was controlled by her Kyrios, her male guardian. This might be her father, then her husband, and, if widowed or orphaned, possibly her own son. She had no say in who this guardian was. She simply followed his will, regardless of her age or ability. And so, for much of the ancient world, the law did not see women as people with rights. It saw them as dependents, like livestock or family heirlooms. They were managed and moved around, protected only insofar as they were valuable to the men around them. A woman's greatest legal function, in many cases, was as a vessel for lineage, for inheritance, for male legacy. Her body carried the next generation, but the rights to those children belonged exclusively to the father. In the ancient Hebrew legal tradition, which heavily influenced modern religious law, women were similarly restricted. The Mosaic Law granted certain protections to women, such as punishment for rape or obligations in marriage, but these were often structured around the man's rights, not the woman's well-being. For example, if a woman was raped, the punishment was not necessarily about the woman's trauma. It was framed as a violation of her father's property. In some cases, the rapist could simply marry the victim and pay the father a fee, provided he agreed to the arrangement. The woman's consent was not always part of the process. In Mesopotamia, the famed Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest written legal codes, provided some regulations for women's behavior, but these again were focused on keeping the patriarchal structure intact. A wife who was accused of adultery could be drowned unless her husband pardoned her. A daughter who shamed her family could be disowned or punished harshly. The laws did not consider her feelings, intentions, or defenses. The structure was rigid, hierarchical, and deeply one-sided. Even in societies where women had more visible roles, like ancient Egypt or the Etruscan civilization, legal rights were still skewed. Egyptian women had more independence than most. They could own property, initiate divorce, and sign contracts. But this did not mean full equality. Social expectations still dictated that women defer to men in most public and religious settings. And often, those legal rights were limited to women of wealth or noble birth. A poor woman, a slave, or a servant had few, if any, legal avenues for justice. The Roman practice of Manus marriage is particularly telling. In this form of union, a woman passed directly from the authority of her father to that of her husband. She became part of his family, his household, and under his legal power. He had the right to discipline her, manage her property, and make decisions about her life. Divorce, when allowed, was also male-controlled. A man could often cast off his wife with little justification, while a woman needed significant cause and male support to escape an unhappy or abusive marriage. And even if she succeeded, her reputation was permanently stained in court proceedings. Women were discouraged from speaking in public. Their voices were considered too emotional, too unstable, or simply too unimportant. A woman might witness a crime, but her testimony carried less weight than that of a male stranger. A woman might be the victim of a theft or abuse, but unless a man advocated on her behalf, she had little recourse. Justice was not blind, it simply looked the other way. This legal invisibility extended to inheritance. In most cultures, daughters received less or nothing at all compared to sons. Property was passed through the male line, and daughters were expected to marry out and take dowries instead. The idea that a woman might independently control land, livestock, or wealth was seen as destabilizing. It threatened the male order. It threatened the lineage. And so the law became another cage, not made of iron or stone, but of parchment and decree, a cage of rules that told women where to stand, how to speak, and what to accept. A cage that didn't need bars because it had centuries of custom and religion behind it. Women didn't just live outside the law, they were shaped by their exclusion from it. They were taught to obey because resistance brought shame. They were taught to be invisible because visibility invited danger. There were exceptions. Of course, powerful queens, wealthy widows, high priestesses, but these were rare and often subject to the whims of male rulers and politics. And when such women overstepped their bounds or threatened the male order, they were quickly punished, diminished, or erased. History has a long habit of forgetting. Female power and remembering female failure dot in every legal code. In every system of governance, the absence of women's rights was not accidental. It was intentional, a reflection of a world that feared women's autonomy more than it valued their humanity. And so, for the vast majority of ancient women, life was not about justice. It was about survival. To live without rights meant to live in the shadows, to love carefully, to speak softly, to walk a narrow path bordered by expectations. The law did not protect them. It regulated them. It didn't serve them. It silenced them. And in the ancient world, silence was the safest thing a woman could offer. Education? Not for you in the modern world. Education is often spoken of as a right, something that unlocks opportunity, lives, and allows a person to imagine themselves differently than the generation before. But in the ancient world, for women, education was more like a locked door, not just closed but guarded. Behind that door sat the tools of influence and intellect: reading, writing, rhetoric, philosophy, arithmetic. And in front of it stood men, quietly or loudly saying, "No, not for you." For the vast majority of ancient women, education was not a path to empowerment. It was a temptation to be resisted, a risk to family reputation, or simply a concept that didn't even arise. A girl's mind, it was thought, did not need sharpening, only her obedience. Her hands needed to be taught to spin and sew, not to write and calculate. Her voice was to be trained in politeness, not persuasion. Her memory was for family recipes and religious rituals, not law or literature. What she needed to know, they believed she could learn from her mother, her grandmother, or her mistress in the kitchen. In ancient Greece, the birthplace of So. Many pillars of Western thought education was fiercely guarded by men. Athens, often praised for its golden age of learning, was a city where female literacy was not only rare but discouraged. Boys were taught to recite Homer, debate ideas, and memorize the works of philosophers. Girls, meanwhile, were mostly confined to the home. If they were taught at all, it was in domestic skills. A small number of elite Athenian women may have learned to read, but it was considered improper for a woman to display her knowledge in public. If she did, she was ridiculed, or worse, labeled dangerous. One of the few exceptions to this was the city of Sparta. Spartan girls were trained in physical education, running, wrestling, and preparing to be strong mothers of strong sons. But even there, intellectual education remained minimal. The idea was not to broaden her mind, but to strengthen her body for childbirth. She was still a vessel for the state, a physically fit vessel, but one that did not need poetry or politics. In ancient Rome, the story was similar. Boys studied grammar, rhetoric, logic, and law. They were prepared for civic life, for leadership, for history making. Girls were prepared for marriage. They might learn to read basic Latin or Greek if their family was wealthy. But few girls were formally educated beyond what was needed to run a household. Reading was sometimes tolerated. Writing was less so. A literate woman might be seen as cunning or subversive. In many households, it was simply not worth the risk. A clever daughter could attract unwanted attention, or become too aware of her own lack of power. There were women who broke through, of course. Poets like Sulpicia in Rome or Sappho in Greece, who dared to write and be heard. Philosophers like Hypatia of Alexandria, who taught mathematics and astronomy before she was brutally murdered by a mob. But these women were the exception. Their lives, though inspiring, were lonely. Their fame often came at the cost of their safety. Their names survived precisely because they were so rare. In ancient China, Confucian teachings laid out a very specific vision for what women should and should not learn. Girls were taught the 3 obediences to their father before marriage. their husband during marriage, and their sons in widowhood. Education, unless it was about how to be obedient, was unnecessary. Confucius himself stated that women were inferior and that educating them was wasteful. Instead, girls were taught domestic arts, weaving, cooking, managing a household. Any written instruction they received often focused on moral behavior, modesty, and the rituals of proper womanhood. Literacy existed among noble women, especially during certain dynasties, but it was tightly regulated and rarely encouraged in India. Education for girls varied by era and caste, but in general, sacred knowledge, the Vedas, the philosophical texts, the ritual instructions was restricted to men. Girls from upper castes might learn poetry or music, particularly if they were expected to become entertainers or courtesans. But again, this education was not meant to empower. It was meant to make them more pleasing, more marketable, more controlled. A learned woman was often a woman under surveillance. Even in ancient Egypt, where women had comparatively more rights than in other ancient societies, formal education was largely a male domain. While women could inherit property, sue in court, or serve as priestesses, the scribal schools where literacy was taught and state administrators were made were reserved for boys. A literate woman existed, yes, but was seen as unusual. A curiosity, not a standard. The consequences of this systemic denial were profound. Without access to education, most ancient women could not read religious texts, legal codes, or even letters from loved ones. They were dependent on the men in their lives, not just for protection, but for knowledge. They couldn't study the law that governed them. They couldn't read the contracts they were bound to. They couldn't write their own stories or read those of others. Their worlds remained small because the words that might have expanded them were locked away. This lack of access didn't just stunt personal growth, it erased generations of voices. How many female thinkers, poets, and philosophers disappeared into history because they never learned to write their names? How many mothers had ideas that could have improved society, healed illnesses, or sparked revolutions, but could only whisper them in the dark to children too young to remember? And for those few women who did find learning, who learned in secret or under the protection of wealth, education was a kind of double-edged sword. It brought awareness, but also isolation. A woman who could write might pen beautiful verses, only to have them attributed to a man. A woman who could argue might win an audience once, only to be banned from speaking again. The ancient world did not value educated women. It tolerated them, briefly, like flickers of light that were soon extinguished. What made it worse was that the denial of education was often presented as protection. Families told their daughters that learning was too difficult, too burdensome, that they were keeping them safe. That books were for men who bore the weight of public life. That women had a more sacred duty to bear children, to keep homes, to serve the gods quietly through obedience. And many women accepted this, not because they believed it, but because there was no alternative. Generation after generation of girls grew up in the shadow of books they were not allowed to touch, temples they could not enter, debates they could not join. They heard stories told to them, never by them. They saw scrolls, but only held brooms. They learned to count not in numbers, but in steps between the kitchen, the loom, and the marriage bed. And so the mind of the ancient woman remained largely a secret, lost, undocumented, and shaped not by what was possible, but by what was forbidden. In denying her education, the ancient world denied itself half of its potential. And in doing so, it ensured that the curse of silence would continue, not just in public halls or sacred temples, but in the very hearts of women who might have imagined more, if only they had been given the words. The marriage trap, childhood brides. In many ancient societies, marriage was not a chapter in the story of love. It was a transaction, a negotiation, a formal agreement written not in passion or poetry, but in livestock, land, or coin. And for girls, often still children, This transaction determined everything. Marriage was not something they anticipated with excitement. It was something that simply happened to them, early, suddenly, often without warning or consent. Like a door closing behind them with a thud. For a girl born in the ancient world, marriage was not a matter of if, but when. And when was far earlier than most modern listeners might imagine. In many cultures, girls were betrothed by the time they were 6 or 7 and married off shortly after their first menstruation, sometimes even before. The physical and emotional cost of this cannot be overstated. These were not women, but children still playing with dolls, still learning to speak properly, suddenly handed over to much older men, bound in a contract they had no voice in creating. The logic behind such early marriages was both economic and cultural. A daughter was considered a financial liability to her family. She would not inherit land. She would not carry the family name. She needed a dowry, a sum of money, goods, or property, offered to her husband's family like a payment for taking her in. The sooner she married, the sooner the burden was lifted. And the younger the bride, the more control the husband's family had over her. A pliable child was far easier to shape than a grown woman with opinions, dreams, or memories of freedom. In ancient India, the laws of Manu, an influential set of texts outlining social conduct, clearly stated that a girl should be married before puberty. It was considered shameful for a father to allow his daughter to remain unmarried after she began menstruating. She was seen as vulnerable, her chastity at risk. In the patriarchal logic of the time, early marriage was considered protective. Better to bind her quickly than to risk scandal or dishonor. In ancient Rome, noble families arranged marriages not for love, but for alliance and status. A well-placed marriage could cement a political relationship, secure territory, or climb the social ladder. Young girls, sometimes as young as 12, were engaged to older senators or generals, men decades their senior. These girls left their childhood homes and entered vast villas or military camps, expected to form as wives, hostesses, and eventually mothers. Their bodies may not have been ready. Their minds certainly were not, but readiness was not a concern. Only duty. The legal minimum age for marriage in Rome was 12 for girls. But legality didn't always align with morality or mercy. In rural areas or among lower classes, girls were sometimes married even earlier. Their small frames draped in bridal garments that didn't quite fit. Their futures were sealed with a feast, a contract, and a farewell to anything resembling childhood. In ancient Greece, the marriage system was equally rigid. Girls were typically married by the age of 14, sometimes younger. A father arranged the match, considering family reputation and economic benefit. The girl had no say. Her mother might console her, dress her, prepare her for the wedding bed, but the decision had already been made. Athenian women, in particular, were expected to move from the control of their father to that of their husband without ever experiencing a moment of personal freedom. It was a straight line, drawn in silence. The wedding itself was not a joyful day for the bride. It was often filled with rituals designed to erase her old identity and mark her transition into ownership. In Rome, the bride wore a veil and was symbolically kidnapped from her family, mimicking the ancient story of the Saban women. In Greece, the bride was led through ceremonial bathings and offerings. Her hair often cut or rearranged, her clothing changed to reflect her new status. It was less about celebration and more about transformation. A child turned into a commodity. Once married, the expectations were immediate and harsh. The child bride was expected to serve her husband, produce heirs, and manage a household she barely understood. She might be terrified. She might be physically harmed. She might not even understand what was happening on her wedding night. But in most cultures, there was no recourse. Marital rights belonged entirely to the husband. The girl's emotions, fears, and physical safety were not considered. If she protested, she might be punished. If she cried, she was told to grow up, and there was nowhere to run. Divorce was rarely in the woman's hands. In many ancient societies, only men could initiate divorce. If a child bride tried to flee or resist, she could be sent back in shame or worse, face legal punishment. Her family might not accept her. Her reputation would be ruined. She would be labeled as defective, disobedient, or impure. She would not be welcomed back as a daughter. She would be discarded as a failed product. In ancient China, arranged marriages were governed by strict Confucian ideals. Harmony between families was paramount. Girls were matched with grooms based on astrology, social rank, and parental decision-making. The bride might never see her husband's face until the wedding. Red veils and elaborate rituals masked the personal tragedy unfolding beneath the ceremony. In some regions, the bride would be carried in a closed sedan chair, hidden from view, a literal symbol of her invisibility in the entire affair. And sometimes, the bride was too young even to understand what was happening. In some communities, symbolic marriages occurred when girls were still toddlers. The actual cohabitation might not begin until she was older, but the decision was made. Her name was tied to another household. Her life was no longer hers. Not all marriages were cruel. Some husbands were kind. Some couples developed affection, even love. But this does not erase the core issue. These marriages began with imbalance, with inequality, with the removal of choice. The girl bride entered the relationship not as a partner, but as a subordinate without power, without voice, and without the knowledge to understand her own rights had they existed. Motherhood followed quickly. A girl might find herself pregnant before her body was mature enough to carry safely. The risks were immense complications during childbirth, infections, miscarriages. Many girls died in labor. Those who survived often lost the baby. And if they failed to produce a son, their value diminished even further. The pressure to deliver male offspring was relentless. A young girl, just past puberty, might endure pregnancy after pregnancy, each one a gamble with her life. But tragedy is not just that child marriage existed, but that it was normalized, accepted, expected. It was part of the fabric of ancient life. To question it was to question the very foundations of family and honor. Girls were taught from the beginning that this was their fate. They didn't dream of love. They dreamed perhaps of a kind husband, or at least one who wouldn't beat them. Their hopes were scaled down to survival. Maybe he'll let me visit my family. Maybe he won't be too old. Maybe he'll wait a little while before the wedding night. And yet, despite all of this, these girls endured. They learned to manage households, to raise children, to navigate complex social codes. They found moments of joy, perhaps in friendship, or ritual, but their lives had been redirected before they had a chance to steer. The marriage trap had snapped shut early, and escape was almost impossible. In the long silence of ancient history. The voices of these girls are nearly gone. We know them only through letters from others, through legal documents, through the edges of stories written by men. But they were there, hundreds of thousands of them. Tiny brides in oversized gowns, children turned into wives. And they remind us that sometimes the cruelties of history are not marked by war or violence, but by a quiet, endless surrender to customs too old to question. The pregnancy paradox, reproduction, or death for ancient women. Childbirth was not a miracle. It was a gamble, a dangerous, bloody, unpredictable gamble played over and over again, often with no tools, no anesthesia. And no say, it was something expected of all women, demanded by families, cultures, and religions alike, and yet behind the rituals and celebrations, it was one of the most common causes of death. To be a woman in the ancient world meant to live in a body that society treated as a reproductive machine, even as it failed to protect that body from the harm that came with it. Pregnancy was not optional. From the moment a girl married, often while still a child, she was expected to begin producing children, quickly, ideally boys. Her value as a wife, as a daughter-in-law, and even as a woman was measured by how many sons she bore. And the first pregnancy often arrived before her hips were fully formed. Before her mind could grasp what was happening inside her body, The pressure was immense, and the consequences of failure were severe. But success, too, came with danger. In societies where medical knowledge was rudimentary and midwives relied more on superstition than science, childbirth was frighteningly fatal. Infections, hemorrhages, obstructed labor, these were not rare complications. They were common. And with no understanding of bacteria, no sterile equipment, and very few effective remedies, even a minor complication could become deadly. For every child born, the mother's life hung in the balance. In ancient Egypt, birthing was aided by midwives. And goddesses, spells were inscribed on amulets, and fertility deities were invoked for protection. But behind these prayers were crude techniques. They barely dulled pain, birthing bricks that forced awkward positions, and no way to intervene if the baby was breech. The woman was often surrounded by family or female attendants, but comfort did not equal safety. Death in childbirth was so expected that tombs for young mothers often included tiny coffins for stillborn infants. Already prepared in Greece and Rome, medical theory was heavily influenced by men like Hippocrates and Galen, who, despite their pioneering status, had limited understanding of female anatomy. They believed the womb could wander around the body, causing hysteria. They saw the uterus as both sacred and dangerous. And while they documented various methods of assisting labor, these often involved bleeding, purging, or other now obsolete and unsafe practices. Caesarean sections were rarely attempted on living women. When they were performed, the mother almost always died. For poor women, the risks were even greater. Without access to even the most basic midwives or herbal remedies, they gave birth. Alone or with the help of untrained neighbors. They delivered in cramped, unclean rooms on dirt floors or wooden benches, sometimes while still working in fields or homes. There were no prenatal visits, no sterile gloves, no emergency plans. If something went wrong, the only options were prayer and pain, and yet women were expected to go through this ordeal not once, but many times. It was common for ancient women to give birth to 5, 10, or even 15 children over their lifetimes, not out of abundance, but necessity, because so many children died young. Infant mortality was staggering. In some communities, only half of all children survived their first year. Mothers grieved constantly. They buried tiny bodies over again, and then they became pregnant once more. Miscarriages were poorly understood and often blamed on the mother herself. Had she eaten the wrong food, walked too much, experienced fear or sadness? The loss of a pregnancy brought not just grief, but shame. In some societies, it was seen as a bad omen. In others, a punishment. There were no counseling services. Number: medical scans. No explanation. Just silence, blame, and another attempt. Contraception existed, but only in primitive and unreliable forms. Women in ancient Greece and Egypt used pessaries made from honey, acacia leaves, or crocodile dung. Some cultures encouraged herbal teas or amulets to prevent pregnancy. But few methods were consistent, and almost none were controlled by the woman. Abstinence was the only sure path, and that too was rarely in her control. A wife could not refuse her husband without risk of punishment. A concubine had no say at all. In ancient China, women were often confined to their rooms for long. Periods during pregnancy, sometimes treated as fragile vessels, other times expected to continue working until the final days. Postpartum care was deeply ritualized, sitting the month, in which women were isolated and forbidden to leave their beds. This was meant to protect them, but it also reflected the belief that childbirth made a woman temporarily impure. While lying in bed, she was kept from visiting temples or participating in society. Her body had done its job, but it had also made her taboo. In India, the expectation of fertility was deeply tied to religion and caste. A woman who failed to produce children, especially sons, was often labeled cursed. She might be mocked, ostracized, or even replaced. In polygamous households, a childless wife might be pushed aside for a younger, more fertile woman. And yet, the tools to address infertility were minimal. Ayurveda offered some herbal remedies, but little real help. The pain of infertility was not just physical, it was social and spiritual exile. And if the child survived, mother's work did not end. She was expected to nurse, to feed, to carry, to soothe. There were no bottles, no strollers, no formula. Infants were carried on backs, fed by hand, watched constantly. And with each child, her body bore the toll. Teeth lost from calcium deficiency. Bones bent from labor. Organs weakened by strain. The body that had once been seen as sacred became, over time, broken gut. This is the paradox that haunted ancient womanhood. The very thing that defined a woman's value, reproduction, was also the thing most likely to kill her. Her body was prized but not protected. Her womb was worshipped, but her life was not. The same society that demanded her fertility offered her no safety, no rest, and no thanks. Mothers were praised, yes. Statues were built, songs were sung, but behind the symbols were endless hours of work, isolation, and pain. A mother's grief was her own. If she died in childbirth, she became a memory. If she lived, she started the cycle again. There was no pause. Even the rare joy of giving birth to a healthy child was complicated. If it was a girl, the celebration was muted. Another future bride, another dowry, another body trapped in the same cycle. If it was a boy, there was relief, but also fear. Would he survive? Would he provide? Would he repeat the same injustices? In some cultures, women found comfort in shared suffering. Midwives formed bonds. Mothers supported one another in rituals and whispers, but there was little room for rest. The ancient world did not wait. Another child would come soon, so. Pregnancy, in the ancient world, was never simply a blessing. It was a trial, a threat, and a duty. It was praised in public and feared in private. It defined a woman's role while endangering her life. And through it all, she endured. Again and again, because she had no choice. Trapped indoors, life as a domestic prisoner to the outside world. The ancient home was the woman's domain. It was where she was said to rule, a place of comfort and safety. But for countless women across ancient civilizations, the home was not a sanctuary, it was a prison. A soft-walled cage built not from malice, but from tradition. It was where she was expected to spend her life, where she was kept out of sight, and where, most importantly, she was controlled in ancient texts and teachings. The idea of the ideal woman was nearly always one who stayed inside, obedient, modest, and hidden. Not seen, not heard, not interfering with the world outside. Men were for the polis, the forum, the battlefield, the temple. Women were for the hearth, the spinning wheel, and the cradle. This separation wasn't just cultural, it was enforced, often through family rules, religious mandates, and social scorn in ancient Greece, particularly Athens. Women of respectable standing were rarely seen in public. The word for woman in many classical plays was silent one or indoors one. The higher her status, the less she was supposed to be seen. She didn't attend public events, didn't walk freely in the marketplace, didn't speak in the assembly. Instead, she was tucked away in the back rooms of the house, the gymnasium. It was her world, and it was very small. The only men allowed in were close family members. Any appearance in public required a chaperone. Her life played out in corridors and courtyards, behind walls, behind doors. Daily life in that enclosure was exhausting in its sameness. Wake up before dawn, tend to the fire, prepare food, weave cloth, clean, feed children, manage servants if the family had any, tend to the elderly, wash linens by hand, oversee water collection. There was no pause, no leisure, no variation, and no escape. Even leisure, when allowed, was performed like embroidery or music, quiet, contained, feminine. Outside, the world changed. Governments rose and fell, markets bustled. Stories were told, but inside, each day was a repetition of the last dot in Rome. Elite women had a bit more freedom, able to attend baths or festivals on rare occasions. But still, the expectation was that they belonged indoors. Respectable women didn't wander. To do so invited gossip or worse. A woman seen too often in public risked being labeled immoral. A woman who laughed too loudly, spoke too much, or was simply present too long outside the home was seen as a threat to order. There was an invisible leash, and stepping beyond it could mean disgrace. For poorer women, especially slaves or laborers, the restrictions were different. They were not so much confined as consumed. Their homes were not places of rest, but of more work grinding grain, fetching water from distant wells, washing with ash and river stones. Their labor began at sunrise and ended only with exhaustion. But even in their physical freedom of movement, they were not free. Their time, bodies, and futures were controlled by others. They had no more autonomy than the elite wives locked. In marble villas dot in many cultures, a woman's reputation was tied entirely to her visibility. In ancient China, Confucian ideals promoted a deeply patriarchal structure. Men went out, women stayed in. The inner chambers of the house became the woman's entire world. Leaving them without reason was frowned upon. Her duty was to keep the household harmonious, raise obedient children, and serve her in-laws with humility. Her worth was measured not in achievements or talents, but in how well she vanished into her role. Religious texts often reinforced these boundaries. In many interpretations of early Hebrew law, a virtuous woman was one who worked with her hands, rose early, and did not eat the bread of idleness. In Hindu scriptures, a woman's dharma, her sacred duty, was to serve her husband and stay within the home. In early Islamic society, women were instructed to observe modesty and seclusion, particularly those of high status. Across these different beliefs and regions, the message was the same. The home was her rightful place, and stepping beyond it risked dishonor. But the home could also be unbearably lonely. Many ancient women spent entire days without speaking to anyone outside their family. Letters, when they were written, were often dictated by men. News from the outside came through second-hand reports, if it came at all. A woman might live an entire life within a few rooms, hearing only fragments of the world. She could not vote. She could not join guilds or councils. She could not visit libraries. If she had ideas, they had no audience. If she had thoughts, they were whispered into pillows. The architecture of ancient homes reflected this segregation. In Greek houses, women's quarters were built away from entrances. In Roman villas, female servants and wives were expected to remain in more private areas. In some Middle Eastern designs, inner courtyards kept women shielded from public view. These were deliberate layouts, not accidental, but strategic. They were maps of control, and this confinement wasn't just physical. It was intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. A woman's curiosity about the world was often treated as dangerous. She was discouraged from reading, questioning, or even dreaming too much. Girls were told to think only of marriage, of babies, of serving with joy. To want more was considered unnatural, shameful, even sinful. If she protested, there were few places to go. There were no shelters, no therapists, no recourse. If she left her husband or her father's home, she risked starvation, assault, or being branded as a prostitute. Independence was not just rare, it was nearly impossible. She had no legal protection, no money of her own, and no standing in society. The world was not built for her to walk alone. There were exceptions, priestesses, poets, widows with inherited wealth. But these were rare and often regarded with suspicion. A woman who lived alone, spoke freely, or moved through the world unaccompanied was always just one step away from scandal. One misstep could unravel her reputation forever. Even friendships were limited. Women were discouraged from forming bonds outside the family. Female friendships, when they existed, were often restricted to shared work or rituals. Deep emotional support, free of male oversight, was hard to come by. The result was a quiet, persistent isolation. A feeling of being surrounded, but never seen. Some women found ways to reclaim pieces of themselves, through songs, through stories, through quiet acts of rebellion. They carved names on walls, embroidered secret messages, or passed forbiddens, stories through generations. But these small resistances could not break the cage. The walls of the ancient home were thick, not just in stone, but in culture and custom and centuries of assumption, and so the woman of the ancient world remained indoors, not just in body, but in every sense. Her life was private, constrained, and deeply invisible. She was born into a room, and unless she was very lucky or very brave, she never left it. No voice, no choice. Silenced, and society imagined waking up every day knowing your words meant less. That your voice, even when raised, would be heard only as a whisper behind walls. In the ancient world, this was the quiet truth for women everywhere. They were not just discouraged from speaking, they were erased from the public conversation. Altogether, their opinions were unwelcome. Their presence in public life, tightly controlled. To be born a woman was to be born into silence. In most ancient societies, public life was not only dominated by men, it was designed for them. The laws, the markets, the assemblies, the temples, the festivals, all were spaces where women were, either unwelcome or completely forbidden. To speak was to overstep, to question was to defy. And defiance came with consequences. In Athens, the very heart of ancient democracy. Women had no vote. They could not serve in the assembly, could not hold office, and could not even attend most public debates. They were not considered citizens. Their voices held no political weight. Athenian men debated laws, shaped alliances, and decided fates, while their wives remained indoors, their thoughts unheard. Even in matters that directly affected them, marriage, inheritance, war, they had no voice. Their lives were molded by policies they had no hand in shaping. This pattern repeated across cultures. In the Roman Republic and Empire, women were similarly excluded from public office and civic leadership. While elite women might be able to influence powerful husbands or sons behind closed doors, they were never the ones standing in the forum or drafting the laws. Their letters, speeches, and writings, if they existed, were rarely preserved. Even when women held influence, it was carefully cloaked in quiet diplomacy or familial duty. Power could be whispered, but never claimed in ancient Mesopotamia. Women were included in economic life to a limited extent. They could be traders or landowners under certain conditions, but their political voices were absent. There were no female lawmakers or governors. And though goddesses were worshipped alongside gods, mortal women were not considered fit to speak in their names. Religion might allow a sacred feminine figure, but society kept mortal women far from the altars of power. In ancient Egypt, women had more legal freedom than in many other ancient cultures. They could inherit property, initiate divorce, and manage estates. But socially and politically, their voices were still limited. Pharaohs were male by default. Queens might co-rule or wield informal influence, but they rarely spoke publicly as leaders. Even Cleopatra, one of the few exceptions, was vilified in Roman accounts for being outspoken and politically active. Her downfall was painted not as a political tragedy, but as a cautionary tale of a woman who dared to lead. Religious spaces were no refuge either. In ancient Israel, for instance, women could not become priests or participate in the inner workings of the temple. In ancient India, women were discouraged from reading or interpreting the sacred texts. The Vedas, the heart of Hindu philosophy, were the domain of male Brahmins. Women could listen, but not question. In Buddhist communities, nuns existed, but were subject to stricter rules and lower status than monks. Even the most devout women found themselves silenced in the very spaces they worshipped. And this silence wasn't just social. It was written into the structure of language and story. In ancient texts, women's voices appear briefly, often, in domestic contexts or tragic ends. They speak when lamenting a son, pleading for a husband, or urging a child toward duty. Rarely do they argue, persuade, or lead. Even when they are wise, their wisdom is wrapped in caution. A woman who speaks too boldly, who challenges a man, is almost always punished. Think of Medea. Think of Cassandra. Think of every woman in myth who dared to speak and suffered for it. This culture of silencing began early. Girls were taught from childhood to listen, not to speak. Their questions were redirected, their thoughts dismissed. In many homes, it was considered shameful for a daughter to speak at the table. In schools, when they were allowed in, girls were not encouraged to argue or debate. A quiet girl was praised. A curious one was corrected. Even in the legal sphere, silence was imposed. In many ancient courts, a woman's testimony was considered unreliable or invalid. She could be the victim of a crime and still need a male witness to confirm her account. She could own land, but not speak in her own defense. If she protested a marriage, her voice might be ignored. If she accused a man, her reputation was on trial more than his actions. Her silence was not just expected. It was enforced, and the silence extended into history itself. Most ancient chronicles, records, and epics were written by men, about men for male audiences. Women appear as side characters, obstacles, prizes, or warnings. Their experiences were not deemed worthy of record. Their thoughts were lost. Entire generations of women lived and died without leaving behind a single word of their own. There were rare exceptions. Sappho of Lesbos, who wrote poetry in her own voice, daring and delicate, and Hajuana, a Sumerian priestess and one of the earliest known female authors who wrote hymns to the gods. Hypatia of Alexandria, a philosopher and teacher whose wisdom made her enemies. But these women stood on precarious ground. Their voices survived in fragments, often through the preservation of men, and many others no less brilliant, were simply forgotten. What's even more tragic is that many ancient women internalized this silence. When you are told from birth that your voice does not matter, you begin to believe it. You choose silence, not just because it's expected, but because it's safer. Speaking becomes a risk, a noise that could provoke ridicule, punishment, or shame. Better to stay quiet. Better to whisper than shout. Better not to speak at all. And so the cycle continued. Mothers taught daughters to be silent, as their mothers had before them. A lineage of muted voices, stretching across centuries. They passed down stories, but only the safe ones. They shared advice, but only in secret. They learned to communicate, in glances, in gestures, in songs sung softly at the loom. The words they might have said were buried in their chests, heavy as stone. Silence, in the ancient world, was more than the absence of speech. It was a tool, a form of control, a cultural, muzzle passed down like an heirloom. It shaped not just how women were seen, but how they saw themselves, not as speakers, not as leaders, but as listeners, dutiful, invisible, and quiet. And in all the noise of ancient history, the clanging of swords, the speeches of emperors, the chants of priests, it is that silence that lingers most, the absence of half the populations. Voice, the hollow space where women should have been heard, punished for everything, shame as a weapon in the ancient world. A woman did not need to commit a crime to be punished. She only needed to exist in the wrong way, too loudly, too freely, too visibly. Her crime could be anything: wearing the wrong clothes, speaking at the wrong time, laughing in public, disobeying an order, or simply growing older. The tool society used to punish her was not always physical. It was more effective than chains. It was shame. Shame was woven into every thread of a woman's life. It began in childhood, the moment she became aware that she was not a boy. Girls were taught early that their bodies were something to cover, their voices something to lower, and their desires something to hide. A curious girl was labeled wild, a playful girl, improper, a bold girl, dangerous, and so she learned to be small, not just in body, but in behavior. Not just at home, but in her very thoughts. In ancient Greece, a woman's reputation was her only armor, and it was paper thin. A single rumor could ruin her. If she was seen talking to a man in the marketplace, questions arose. If she walked without a veil, whispers followed. If she smiled too often or looked too confident, people assumed the worst. She was guilty until proven invisible. And there was no formal trial, just the slow erosion of respect. Once lost, it could never be fully regained. The shame was tied closely to the idea of purity. In many ancient societies, a woman's virginity was not just personal, it was public property. Her worth in marriage depended on it. Her family's honor rested on it. Entire lineages were said to be sullied by one girl's supposed misstep. A single accusation, true or false, could destroy her future. And if she was sexually assaulted, it was often she who bore the disgrace. Her consent didn't matter. Her suffering didn't either. What mattered was that she had been damaged, and that damage made her unfit to die in Rome. Women were punished not just for deeds, but for desires. Adultery was treated as a public offense, but only for women. Men could stray without consequence. Women could not. A wife caught cheating could be divorced, disinherited, even exiled. Her children might be taken from her. Her name blackened forever. But if her husband was unfaithful, it was shrugged off. Boys will be boys. A man's hunger was natural. A woman's, corrupt. Religious laws often deepened this imbalance. In many ancient Hebrew laws, a woman accused of infidelity could be subjected to public humiliation, forced to drink bitter water in a ritual meant to reveal her guilt. In ancient Hindu texts, a widow was considered impure and unlucky. She was expected to renounce all comfort, wear plain clothes, sleep on the ground, and never remarry. In some periods, she might be expected to commit sati, throwing herself onto her husband's funeral pyre, voluntarily or not. Even menstruation, a natural cycle, became a source of shame. In ancient Mesopotamia, and later in many other regions, menstruating women were considered impure. They were barred from temples, from preparing food, from touching sacred objects. They were isolated, made to feel unclean, for something entirely biological. Some were required to sleep outside or bathe in ritualistic ways to cleanse themselves before returning to society, a process that reinforced the idea that their bodies were dirty. Shameful and lesser, widowhood brought its own particular torment. A woman who had lost her husband was no longer useful to society. She was often seen as a burden or, worse, a threat. In ancient China, widows were praised for remaining loyal to their dead husbands for life. Remarriage was frowned upon. Even if she had been married at 13 and widowed by 15, she was expected to live the rest of her life in mourning, her youth sacrificed to the memory of a man. Some wore white for decades. Others chose suicide, seeing no other future. Even aging itself was a kind of punishment in a world that prized youth and fertility above all. An older woman became invisible, or mocked, or feared. If she was no longer a childbearer, what was she? A crone, a gossip, a witch. Her wisdom, gained through years of endurance, was ignored. Her body, once sacred for its reproductive power, was now seen as repulsive. Older women were sometimes blamed for misfortunes in the village or suspected of causing illness. With evil eyes or curses, their punishment was isolation or, worse, in the rare case that a woman rose to power, society often responded with ridicule or suspicion. She must have used sorcery, they said, or sex, or manipulation. A powerful woman was not admired, she was feared, and she was usually brought down. Her downfall, when it came, was often brutal. And then it was retold as a warning to other women: do not rise, do not speak, do not want too much. But perhaps the most heartbreaking form of punishment was the one women inflicted upon themselves. After years of hearing that they were weak, sinful, or shameful, many believed it. They accepted blame for things they had not done. They apologized for existing. They stayed quiet when they should have screamed. Shame taught them not just to obey, but to self-police, to monitor their own bodies, thoughts, and movements, to clip their own wings before anyone else had to. Mothers passed this shame down, not out of cruelty, but out of love. They wanted to protect their daughters. They told them to walk carefully, to speak softly, to stay home, not because they hated them, but because they knew what happened to girls who didn't. In this way, the cycle continued not from laws alone, but from survival strategies. From fear dressed up as wisdom, and so women in the ancient world lived. Under the constant threat of punishment for being too much. Too little, too visible, too free. Shame was not an accident. It was a system, a mechanism of control that did not need chains, because it had culture. It did not need guards, because it had mothers, neighbors, and priests. The saddest part. It worked. For thousands of years it worked, but in the quiet spaces, in the corners of kitchens, in the softness of lullabies, women remembered who they were. Not just bodies to be shamed, but minds, soul, people, and though they could not always speak, their truth, they carried it, and passed it along in whispers. When work wasn't liberation, labor without choice. In the modern world, work is often viewed as a form of empowerment, a way to earn, to build, to define one's place in society. But in the ancient world, for women, work was not a path to freedom. It was just another burden, another expectation, another set of chains. Only these ones were tied to spinning wheels, water jugs, broom handles, and the endless cries of children. Whether she was born into wealth or poverty, a woman in ancient times worked, but rarely by choice, and never with thanks. For wealthy women, the illusion of rest was just that, an illusion. Though they were spared from the backbreaking physical labor of the fields or the forge, their lives were far from idle. The ancient home was a complex system that demanded constant supervision. A noble woman might be responsible for the coordination of dozens of servants, the management of household accounts, the education of children, the maintenance of food stores, and the spinning, dyeing, and sewing of cloth for the entire family. And she did all this from within the confines of her home, under the constant pressure to be perfect, graceful, obedient, and above all, quiet. She was a manager without recognition, an accountant without respect, a teacher without pay. Her labor was invisible because it was expected. It did not count as work because it was her place. If the household failed, the shame was hers. If it thrived, the credit belonged to her husband, and that was the easy version for women of the lower classes. There was no such thing as a division between home and labor. Everything was work. In ancient Egypt, women carried jars of water on their heads across miles of hot, cracked earth. They pounded grain into flour with stones until their hands bled. They nursed their own children and the children of others. In the markets, they might sell vegetables or woven goods, standing in the sun from morning until dusk. And when they returned home, there was still more to do: food to prepare, tools to mend, elders to care for in ancient Mesopotamia. Women worked in breweries, in textile workshops, in temples, and sometimes even in the fields. They were laborers, scribes, midwives. But even when they earned wages, their pay was lower than men's and often controlled by their husbands or fathers. A woman might spend all day weaving fine cloth, only to have the money pocketed by a male relative. Her labor was hers. Her reward was not in ancient Greece and Rome. Enslaved women formed the brutal underclass that powered domestic life. They were the silent hands that cleaned, cooked, fetched, and nursed. They bathed their mistresses, combed their master's hair, scrubbed stone floors until their knees ached. They were beaten when they made mistakes, sold when they grew old, used in ways that words cannot always capture. Their labor was total. It consumed their days and their bodies, and it was never a choice. They were born into servitude or taken as war spoils or sold by desperate parents. They were not just workers. They were property. Even in religious life, women worked, but not freely. In many ancient temples, female attendants and priestesses were bound to sacred duties that offered no autonomy. Some were honored, yes, but many were cloistered, confined, and expected to remain chaste, obedient, and perfectly devoted. A misstep meant disgrace. A question meant dismissal. Some so-called sacred women were little more than temple slaves, trapped in rituals that served gods and men alike. And the work never stopped. There were no holidays, no weekends. Even during pregnancy, a woman might continue to grind flour, spin wool, tend livestock. Even after childbirth, she would return to her chores within days, sometimes hours. There was no such thing as maternity leave, no relief, no rest. A woman's work was like breathing, expected to continue until the very end. And when a woman aged, her labor did not stop. She might no longer carry water or pound grain, but she was expected to care for grandchildren, keep the hearth lit, or pass on household wisdom to younger women. Her work became more invisible, more taken for granted. She became part of the background, like furniture. Useful, but unnoticed. Worse still, if a woman refused to work or simply failed, she was judged harshly. Laziness in a man was a flaw. In a woman, it was a moral failure. A wife who did not manage her household efficiently could be beaten. A daughter who refused to help might be married off sooner. A widow who couldn't support herself could be cast out or forced into begging. Work was not empowerment. It was survival. Barely. And yet, through all this, their stories of labor were rarely recorded. Ancient texts celebrate warriors and kings. They list the achievements of merchants and scribes, but who recorded the life of the woman who wove enough linen for 5 children by hand? Who remembered the name of the midwife who stayed up for 2 nights helping another woman give birth? Who honored the woman who carried clay pots in the rain or fetched reeds for her aging father's roof? Their work was invisible. Their names? Forgotten. Even artwork and sculpture, when it showed women at work, did so through an idealized lens. Women milking goats, spinning wool, kneading dough all, shown with serene expressions, as if to suggest joy or simplicity. But behind those images was a deeper truth. The strain in their backs, the rawness of their hands, the aching muscles, the endless repetition. The silent suffering. Some women did find meaning in their work. They sang while grinding grain. They told stories while weaving. They found camaraderie and shared labor. But this should not be mistaken for freedom. They made the best of a life. They did not choose. They endured. That was all Dot. So when we imagine the ancient woman at work, we must not imagine fulfillment. We must imagine fatigue. We must see her hands, red and cracked, her eyes, weary, her spirit still and silent. She worked not because it gave her identity, but because stopping was never an option, and when she died, the work passed to her daughters. No inheritance, just habits, no gold, just calluses, beauty standards that hurt, decorating for men even in the quiet. Restricted world of ancient womanhood, there was one constant expectation that followed her through every season of life. She had to be beautiful, but beauty in ancient times was not about joy or self-expression or the soft pleasure of feeling lovely. It was a duty, a demand, a silent, unrelenting law written on the skin, the hair, the hips, and the eyes. She was not allowed to simply exist. She had to be ornamental, an offering shaped for the gaze of others. From childhood, she was taught what beauty meant in her time and place. In ancient Egypt, pale skin was considered elegant for women, a sign that she lived indoors and didn't labor under the sun. So women powdered their faces with leaf-based pastes, knowing the poison would soak into their bodies. They painted their eyes with thick kohl, framing their gaze like distant stars. Wigs of human or animal hair were oiled and perfumed, worn to hide thinning scalps or signify wealth. And the pressure was not just aesthetic, it was cultural. To look less than polished was to dishonor your family, your husband, even the gods. In Greece, symmetry was everything. A straight nose, balanced features, fair skin. Women plucked their body hair with seashells or singed it with heated threads. They applied crushed berries to their cheeks and lead-based creams to whiten their skin. The ideal woman was delicate, passive and flawless in appearance. Her beauty was meant to inspire poetry in men and jealousy in other women. But it was not for her. She looked in the mirror not for comfort, but for correction back in Rome. Beauty was a profession. High-status women spent hours each day having their hair styled in complex waves and curls. Slaves often did the work, pulling, braiding, burning, and tying until the head ached. Skin was bleached. Teeth were scrubbed with abrasive powders. Wrinkles were considered shameful, and older women turned to strange remedies, snake fat, mouse dung, even crocodile excrement desperately chasing. The freshness of youth. Perfume was layered thick, not because it pleased the wearer, but because it attracted others. A woman's value could rise or fall on the scent she left behind, but these ideals were rarely attainable. The average woman in any ancient society didn't have the time or money to decorate herself as the elites did, yet she was still judged against those impossible standards. Her body, made strong by labor, was seen as too rough. Her skin darkened by sun and sweat was seen as impure. Her hands, calloused by work, were not soft enough to hold affection. Beauty was the rule, but access to beauty was withheld. And beauty, when achieved, came with no safety. If a woman was too beautiful, she risked being blamed for the desire she provoked. She might be harassed, taken, or even accused of witchcraft. In some cultures, women hid their faces not for modesty, but for survival. Beauty was both currency and curse, capable of lifting her status or destroying her peace. In ancient China, beauty was tied to frailty. Tiny feet, soft voices, pale complexions. Women were expected to walk gracefully, to move slowly, to show restraint in every gesture. Centuries later, this would evolve into the painful ritual of foot binding, where young girls' feet were broken and reshaped to fit into delicate shoes. But even before that, the message was clear. To be desirable was to be small, not just in foot size, but in every aspect. Small in appetite, small in opinion, small in space. In ancient India, beauty was associated with luscious thick hair, dark eyes, a full figure. Women adorned themselves with jewelry, nose rings, anklets, bangles that chimed as they walked. But these ornaments were not just for adornment. They were symbols of ownership. A husband might gift gold to show pride, but it also marked his possession. A woman was to be looked at, but not to look back. She was a painting, not a painter. And everywhere, beauty was short-lived. Youth was precious. Once a woman's body changed, once she gave birth, aged, or showed lines of fatigue, her desirability faded, and with it her social value. The same society that had praised her beauty now ignored her. She became background noise. Her wrinkles were seen not as stories, but as flaws. Her gray hairs not as wisdom, but as decay. Even within marriage, beauty remained a requirement. A wife was expected to stay pleasing. If she didn't, her husband might seek others. And if he did, the blame fell on her. She had let herself go. She had failed in her silent duty. There was no winning. Too plain, and she was dismissed. Too beautiful, and she was envied or punished. Her body was always on display, always under critique. There was no space for personal taste. If a woman liked her curly hair but straight was in fashion, she was expected to burn it flat. If she had broad shoulders, she covered them. If her voice was too deep, she was told to speak more softly. The standard was always shifting, controlled. Not by women, but by the men who looked at them. Even pain was acceptable if it produced the right effect. In some cultures, women dyed their skin or eyes with caustic plant extracts that burned. Others used hot metal combs or sharp stones. Some pierced their ears or noses, not out of preference, but because it was required. Pain was part of the process. Suffering was part of beauty. And when women looked in the mirror, they saw not themselves, but a checklist. Was their hair dark enough? Their skin pale enough? Their waist small enough? Their movements graceful enough? Beauty was not joy. It was labor. It was anxiety. It was pressure etched into their reflections like a scar. Even girls barely past childhood were expected to begin preparing for the role of the beautiful bride. Their bodies were inspected, their postures corrected, their speech trained. They were taught how to decorate themselves, not for fun, but for appeal. The face became a canvas, the body, a bargaining chip. A girl learned early that beauty could mean a better husband, a softer home, a moment of safety. But she also learned that it could make her a target. There was no right answer to that, and so, for ancient women, beauty was a game with no winning side. It consumed time, money, and freedom, and it promised nothing in return. No dignity, no peace, just more judgment. And more work, because to be beautiful was not to be happy. It was to be good property, well kept, well packaged, well behaved, that she might never own her own name in the scrolls of history. But she would be remembered perhaps as lovely or fair, a passing adjective, a decoration fading quietly with time, education denied, keeping her in the dark in the ancient world. Knowledge was not for everyone. It was a gate kept tightly shut, its keys handed only to the select, those deemed worthy by birth, by gender, by power. And when it came to women, the answer was almost always no. Education was not just withheld, it was actively denied. Because to teach a woman was to risk giving her power, and the ancient world feared nothing more than a woman who knew too much. From the earliest days of civilization, literacy was a mark of status. In Mesopotamia, scribes, those rare individuals who could read and write, cuneiform were trained from childhood in strict schools called edibus. Nearly all were boys. Girls were rarely admitted. The clay tablets they wrote on, carefully pressed with reed styluses, recorded trade, law, prayer, and myth. But the stories of women, real women, were left out because they were not the ones. Holding the stylus dot in ancient Egypt, some elite women could read and write, but these were rare exceptions. Education was typically reserved for men entering priesthood or bureaucracy. Boys might learn geometry and astronomy, the sacred rhythms of the Nile, and the rituals of the gods. Girls, meanwhile, learned to grind grain, weave baskets, and remain silent in the presence of men. A few royal daughters were educated alongside their brothers, but even then they were expected to marry, not rule. Even when they could read, they had nowhere to take their voice. Greece, so often celebrated as the cradle of Western knowledge, built its golden age on the exclusion of half its population. Athenian boys studied philosophy, rhetoric, music, and mathematics. They were trained to speak in public, to lead, to argue. Girls, they were trained to be modest. Their education, if any, came at home and focused on managing the household. There were no schoolhouses for them. No Socrates asking them to question the world. No Plato inviting them to the academy. A woman who questioned too much was dangerous. A woman who read too much was odd dot in Sparta. Girls were trained to be physically strong because the state wanted strong mothers. They learned dance, athletics, and music. But they were not taught history or logic or poetry, at least not in the same way as boys. Their knowledge was utilitarian, functional, never philosophical. They were sharpened tools, not thinking. Minds roam to limited women's education. Elite girls might learn to read and write enough to run an estate or pen personal letters, but deeper study law, history, oratory was off limits. Women could not speak in the Senate or plead in court. Why then would they need to know how arguments were structured or how laws were written? The logic was circular. She was denied education because she held no power. And she held no power because she was denied education in ancient India. The Vedas, the foundational texts of Hinduism, were reserved for male Brahmins. To even hear them recited was a privilege. Women were excluded from the sacred knowledge and often barred from reading the scriptures. Girls learned from their mothers how to serve, how to cook, how to obey. Their spiritual knowledge was filtered through ritual, not text. They were not expected to seek enlightenment, only to enable others to do so. In China, Confucian ideals further cemented women's exclusion from education. The three obediences and four virtues taught that a woman must obey her father before marriage, her husband after marriage, and her son in widowhood. Her moral character mattered more than her intellect. Some families taught girls to read poetry or recite classics, but only if it made them more graceful or pleasing. Education was cosmetic, a layer of polish, not a doorway to self-determination. Even in religious spaces where one might imagine greater openness, the barriers remained. In early Christian communities, women were praised for their piety, not their learning. Later, church fathers warned against educating women, claiming it would distract them from their true duties. In many monasteries, nuns were taught basic literacy, but higher theological study was the realm of monks. Women could copy texts. They could illuminate manuscripts with delicate golden ink. But the ideas in those texts were not for them. And when a woman did manage to educate herself through luck or rebellion, she often paid a price. Hypatia of Alexandria, a brilliant mathematician and philosopher, taught men and wrote treatises on astronomy and logic. For this, she was murdered by a mob, her body torn apart, her brilliance reduced to a cautionary tale. She had dared to know too much. Other educated women, like Sappho, were remembered more for their beauty or scandal than their intellect. The message was clear. A smart woman might be tolerated, even admired, but only if she was also pleasing to men. And if she wasn't, she was dangerous. What's most tragic is that this denial of education wasn't just about books or numbers. It was about agency. Without education, a woman could not read the laws that bound her. She could not write her own story or interpret the signs of her own time. She could not argue her innocence or advocate for her children. She could not escape because she did not know the way out. And so, generation after generation, women were kept in the dark. Not because they lacked the capacity to learn, but because others feared what they might do with knowledge. A woman who can read might question a command. A woman who can write might remember what was done to her. A woman who understands the world might try to change it. Instead, she was taught obedience, taught to repeat what she was told, taught to accept what was given. Her mind, like her voice, was trimmed to fit the mold of silence. Yet still, here and there, women found ways to learn. They listened at doors. They watched brothers recite lessons. They practiced writing letters in secret. They memorized songs that held hidden truths. They stitched wisdom into their work and passed it along in lullabies. Education denied is not education erased. The flame flickered in the shadows even when no one saw, but the ancient world was built to keep that flame small, because a world where women could think, write, argue, and remember, that world would look very different. And those in charge preferred it stay the same motherhood without mercy, the unrealistic ideal in every ancient culture. Motherhood was considered the highest calling for a woman. It was her purpose, her pride, her supposed fulfillment. And yet, behind the idealized statues and soft lullabies, motherhood in the ancient world was anything but gentle. It was demanding, dangerous, and often deadly. A woman might be praised for being a mother, but she was rarely protected. She was expected to give everything and ask for nothing in return. From the moment a woman reached childbearing age, her worth was measured by her fertility. Not by her intelligence, not by her kindness, not even by her labor, but by whether she could conceive and how many healthy children she could deliver. If she could not have children, or if her children died, she was often blamed. The fault was hers, even when nature was to blame. And fertility was not treated with compassion. It was treated with suspicion. Perhaps she was cursed. Perhaps she had sinned. Perhaps she simply wasn't woman enough, and if she could bear children, the expectations never stopped. She was supposed to be pregnant, or nursing, or preparing to be one or the other for most of her life. There were no breaks, no choices, no room for hesitation. In ancient Rome, Laws even encourage women to marry young and give birth. Often those with 3 children could gain legal advantages, but only if they were freeborn. The message was clear. Your body belongs to the state, the household, the lineage not to you. But pregnancy was far from safe. Without modern medicine, every birth was a gamble. There were no antibiotics, no clean operating rooms, no anesthetics. A woman could die from infection, blood loss, or complications that today would be easily treated. The mortality rate for mothers was tragically high, and even higher for poor women, who had no access to even the rudimentary midwives or herbal remedies used by the wealthy. And yet, they were expected to endure it again and again, and after birth, the work only intensified. A mother was responsible not just for feeding and clothing her child, but for shaping their entire life while receiving none of the glory. Sons would grow and be honored. Daughters would grow and be married off. The mother remained in the background. If the child succeeded, the father was praised. If the child failed, the mother was blamed. Her work was invisible unless something went wrong. In many societies, children were not even expected to live. Infant mortality rates were high. A woman might give birth to 10 children and bury 5. The grief was constant, but not always acknowledged. A mother's tears were expected to dry quickly. She had other mouths to feed, other bodies to keep alive. And then there were the losses that were chosen for her. In ancient Greece and Rome, infant exposure was common. Unwanted babies, especially girls, were left outside to die. The father made the decision. The mother might plead, might beg, might try to hide the child, but she had no say. Her love didn't matter. Her child could be taken from her because it wasn't the right sex, or born at the wrong time, or simply inconvenient. That pain, the pain of loving a life and being forced to surrender, it was something many women carried silently. And yet, society still demanded more. A mother was expected to be patient, nurturing, tireless, joyful. She was to sacrifice her body, her time, her identity, and do it all with a smile. If she showed frustration, she was scolded. If she sought help, she was weak. If she expressed regret, she was monstrous. There was no room for honesty in motherhood, only performance. Even older women were not spared. A mother never stopped being a mother. Her adult children might use her for childcare. Her sons might move on, but still expect her loyalty. Daughters-in-law might judge her and yet rely on her. She became the quiet keeper of the families. Foundation, unseen and overused. Religion did not always help. In many traditions, motherhood was spiritualized, but only in ways that reinforced obedience. Goddesses of fertility were honored, yes, but mortal mothers were reminded that childbirth was a punishment. In early Christian texts, the pain of labor was a consequence of Eve's sin. Women were expected to embrace suffering as holy. In some interpretations, even dying in childbirth was seen as a kind of martyrdom, an acceptable sacrifice. But the most haunting part of ancient motherhood was how little control women had over their own children. Fathers could dictate where a child lived, who they married, what they inherited. In many cultures, a mother could not even keep custody if she divorced or was widowed. Her children could be taken away, and she had no legal recourse. She gave them life. She raised them. But they were not hers. And in the rare cases where a woman rebelled, where she refused to marry, or to bear children, or to mother in the prescribed way, she was often cast out. Labeled barren, accused of witchcraft, considered unnatural. She was told she had failed not just her family, but her entire purpose. Her womanhood was questioned, and with it, her right to exist peacefully. So when we imagine ancient mothers, we must not picture only lullabies and warm hearths. We must also see the long nights of fever, the empty cradles, the bruised bodies, the exhausted eyes, the quiet grief of losing again and again, and still being told to give more. Motherhood was not the reward, it was the expectation. And mercy rarely entered into it. But in the middle of this merciless cycle, mothers still found ways to love. They rocked their babies with songs whispered through fatigue. They planted herbs to heal fevers. They told stories to help children sleep, even as their own eyes closed from exhaustion. And in those moments, fleeting, fragile, full of unspoken strength, they became something more than what society allowed. They became human, fully, painfully, quietly. No. Escape. The cage of marriage and lawing in the ancient world. Marriage was rarely a love story. It was a contract, a transaction. A cage that looked like a home, and once a woman was placed inside, the doors quietly closed behind her, locked not with iron, but with law. To be married was not just to become a wife. It was to lose your name, your rights, your voice. It was, in many cases, the end of whatever freedom a woman might have briefly tasted in girlhood. Marriage came early. Sometimes as young as 12 or 13, a girl would be promised to a man she had never met or barely knew. Her feelings were not part of the discussion. Her father made the choice, often based on dowries, land, alliances, or social standing. And once decided, the matter was settled. A girl might cry, plead, or fall silent, but she had no power to stop what came next. The wedding was arranged. The girl was exchanged. And a new chapter of quiet submission began. In ancient Rome. The concept of manus meant that a wife was legally transferred from the authority of her father to that of her husband. She became his property, his to manage, discipline, and dispose of if necessary. Roman law allowed a man to divorce his wife easily, but a woman? She had no such power. She could be dismissed, but not leave on her own terms. Her body, her children, her dowry all stayed with the husband. In Greece. Especially in Athens, a wife was little more than a vessel for heirs. She was expected to stay inside the house, out of sight, running the household and bearing sons. She could not own land independently. She could not speak in court. She had no legal identity apart from her male guardian. If widowed, she often returned to her father's house, like property returned after use. And if her husband died without a male heir, she could be forced to marry a male relative to keep inheritance lines tidy. Her feelings, again, were irrelevant. In ancient Mesopotamia, the Code of Hammurabi detailed the many ways a woman could be punished within marriage. If a wife was accused of infidelity, even without proof, she could be thrown into the river to determine her guilt by divine judgment. If she was barren, her husband could take another wife or cast her aside. Yet if she left the marriage, no matter the abuse, she could face death. The laws favored male control at every turn, wrapped in the language of order and tradition. In ancient India, texts like the Manusmriti declared that a woman should never be independent, not in childhood, not in youth, not in widowhood. Her entire life was to be lived under male authority. Marriage was considered sacred and unbreakable. A woman who defied her husband could be cast out, disgraced, or even killed. And if her husband died, her suffering didn't end. As a widow, she was expected to live in austerity, never remarrying, often shunned and left to depend on charity or disappear into silence. In early China, Confucian values cemented the submissive role of the wife. She was to serve her husband, his parents, and eventually her son. Her duty was to uphold harmony through obedience. If she failed, shame followed. A disobedient wife could be divorced for something as minor as speaking too freely or not bearing a son. And yet, if a husband was cruel or neglectful, she had no legal grounds to leave. The laws were not written for her. They were written about her, even in societies where divorce was technically allowed. The path for a woman was treacherous. In Egypt, women had more legal freedom than in many other cultures, and some could divorce their husbands. But the process often left them without children, property, or social standing. A divorced woman was viewed with suspicion, damaged, dishonorable, dangerous. Her prospects for remarriage were slim. Her safety, uncertain. And so most women stayed. Even in loveless marriages, even in violent ones, they stayed because they had no money, no family to return to, no rights to reclaim their children. They stayed because leaving meant risking starvation, isolation, or worse. They stayed because the world was built to ensure they had nowhere else to go. Marriage was praised in poems and religion and story. It was painted as a woman's happy ending. But behind the verses and blessings was the truth. Marriage was not a partnership. It was a transfer of ownership, a beautiful cage, dressed in ceremony. The duties of a wife were never ending. She was expected to serve meals, raise children, manage the household, please her husband, and ask for nothing. Her obedience was taken for granted, her silence admired, her suffering ignored. And if she resisted, if she raised her voice, refused to comply, tried to escape, she was punished by the law, by society, by her own family, who might send her back with instructions to behave better. There were no shelters, no courts that listened, no protections against cruelty cloaked in marital rights. Even her children did not belong to her. In most ancient cultures, they were the property of the father. A woman who left her husband could lose everything, including the babies she had nursed, rocked, and protected. Her labor meant nothing. Her love, discounted. Her rights erased. In the eyes of the law, she was not a person. She was a role, a wife, a mother, a servant. And if she failed in any of those roles, the punishment was swift, sometimes legal, sometimes social, always crushing. And yet, within these cages, women still found ways to live. They told stories to their daughters. They supported each other. In small, quiet acts of rebellion, whispers in the courtyard, smuggled coins, carefully remembered recipes from happier times. They endured, not because they accepted their fate, but because they had no choice. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest part of all. Not that marriage was difficult or painful, but that it was inescapable. That the law gave no room for refusal. That love had nothing to do with it. That marriage was not the dream. It was the trap. Witchcraft, madness, and exile. When she stepped out of line, there was always a line. An invisible threshold that every woman in the ancient world was expected. To stay behind, it was drawn not in ink, but in silence, in obedience, in modesty. It wasn't written on stone tablets or chiseled into temple walls, but it was felt in every glance, every whisper, every law. And if a woman crossed it intentionally or not, the consequences were swift, merciless, and often terrifying. Because to step outside the role of a proper woman was to become something else entirely, a witch, a madwoman, a danger. Something to be feared, something to be punished. The definition of stepping out of line varied. Sometimes it meant speaking too much. Other times, not marrying, being childless, dressing with too much care or not enough, knowing things women weren't supposed to know, being old and alone, healing people, questioning tradition. All of these were potential crimes, even if never written in law. The moment a woman stopped fitting the mold, society began reshaping her identity for her. She was no longer just different. She was dangerous. In many ancient societies, accusations of witchcraft were the easiest way to remove a woman who didn't belong. In ancient Mesopotamia, clay tablets describe rituals to ward off women believed to be witches, women said to cause illness, infertility, or storms. Sometimes all it took was a strange look or a misunderstood word. The accusation didn't need proof. It only needed fear. In ancient Greece, the line between healer and witch was razor thin. Women who understood herbs, midwifery, or natural medicine were often respected when their efforts worked, but feared when they didn't. A difficult birth, a sick child, a sudden fever, blame could fall on the midwife. She had touched the body. Maybe she had cursed it. The same hands that helped life enter the world could be accused of poisoning it. In Rome, older women living alone were easy targets. They were seen as strange, bitter, or full of hidden powers. Women without husbands or children were already viewed with suspicion. If she was too quiet, she was hiding something. If she was too outspoken, she was clearly unhinged. If she knew too much about the moon or the plants or a man's sickness, She must have made a pact with spirits. And so the whispers grew louder. Madness was another convenient label. In societies where women were rarely allowed to express their true feelings, any deviation from passive behavior could be rebranded as hysteria. A woman who mourned too long, who screamed in grief, who refused to eat, who wandered at night, these were not signs of sorrow or trauma. They were signs of madness. Her womb, some believed, had wandered through her body, poisoning her mind. This was the theory of hysteria, rooted in the Greek word for uterus hystera. Her madness wasn't a matter of mental health. It was biology. Womanhood, gone wrong. And once labeled mad, she could be locked away, removed from her family, sent to live with distant relatives. In some cases, left to die alone. There was no diagnosis. No help, just dismissal. Her pain was not worth understanding. It was easier to call her unstable than to admit that the world had driven her that in India and parts of the ancient Middle East, women accused of challenging the natural order through disobedience. Magic or strange behavior were sometimes exiled, banished from the community, sent into forests or deserts, left to wander alone. She might be told to live as an ascetic, stripped of possessions and ties. This wasn't always framed as punishment. Sometimes it was cast as religious purification. But the truth remained. Exile was removal. A way to make her disappear without needing to understand her. Even beauty could provoke fear. In some cultures, a woman who was too beautiful was seen as a threat. If men desired her too much, she must be enchanting them. If women envied her, she must be manipulating something unseen. Beauty, like knowledge, was dangerous in the wrong hands. And the hands of a woman were always considered the wrong hands. And so over and over again, the story repeated. A woman stepped out of line. She dared to live differently. And society turned on her. Sometimes she was humiliated, paraded through streets, her hair cut, her clothes torn. Sometimes she was cast out, banished from family, temple, or town. Sometimes she was punished and silenced, shunned, ignored, erased from memory. Sometimes she was simply killed. And what made it worse was how easily it could happen. A single rumor, a passing insult, an angry husband, a jealous neighbor. And suddenly the woman became something else, a symbol of what not to be. A warning to others. The line she crossed. It was always shifting. Women didn't know where it was until they had already stepped over it. But not all of these women were broken. Some used the labels as armor. The so-called witches learned to lean into their knowledge. The so-called madwomen whispered truth. No one else dared speak. The exiled ones found strange peace in solitude. And though their stories were often lost or twisted by time, their existence mattered. They stood as proof that not all women bowed quietly, that some walked away, that some survived. Still, survival came at a cost. Safety, belonging, choice, to live as herself. A woman often had to live alone or be remade into something frightening, something society could explain away. Which, mad woman, widow, crone, not woman, not human, but something else entirely. And so the line remained thin, invisible, always waiting, forgotten. History, the quiet erasure history, we're told, is a record of the past, of what happened, of who lived, who built, who ruled. But the truth is more complicated. History remembers what it is told to remember. It listens to the loudest voices. It follows the winners, the rulers, the men with pens and power. And in that selective remembering, the lives of ancient women began to fade. Not all at once, not in fire or flood, but in silence, in omission. In the quiet decision not to write her name. In the earliest texts, women appear only as shadows beside. Men. In Sumerian tablets, we read about kings and gods, merchants and judges. But where is the weaver, the midwife, the girl who ground barley before dawn? Her life was as real as the warriors, but the clay does not record her breath. Only his battles. In Egyptian carvings, queens appear beside their husbands smiling, adorned, eternal. But who were they, really? What did they think, hope, fear? Their faces were idealized, their titles inherited, their identities flattened into symbols. Even when a woman held power like Hatshepsut, she was often depicted as a man, her body and name altered to fit the narrative of authority. Power, it seemed, could only wear a male face. Greek historians, so fond of detail, wrote thousands of lines about wars and politics, but rarely about women's daily lives. When they did mention women, it was to warn or mock or idealize. The faithful Penelope, the dangerous Helen, the noble Antigone. Fictional or real, their stories were reshaped until they served as lessons, not portraits. They became metaphors, not people. Roman writers filled scrolls with speeches, poems, and laws. They praised their mothers in passing, flirted with mistresses in verse, insulted women who talked too much. But what of the enslaved woman who cleaned the floors of the Senate? What of the girl who stitched tunics for soldiers? What of the grandmother who told stories by firelight? Their lives left no record, except in the wear of stone steps and the ashes of cook fires. And so, over centuries, a pattern formed. Women existed, but they were not remembered. Or if they were distorted. A woman became someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's downfall. She was not the center of her own story. She was an accessory too. Someone else's. Even the rare women who wrote, the poets, the scholars, the mystics, faced the same quiet deletion. Sappho's verses survived only in fragments. Enheduanna, the Sumerian priestess poet, once held one of the oldest authorial voices, but for centuries her work lay buried and misattributed. Hypatia of Alexandria, murdered for her brilliance, was later reduced to a footnote. And most others, gone. Their writings crumbled, their names erased. Their ideas claimed by men who came later. The loss wasn't always violent. Sometimes it was gentle, even polite. A historian might simply skip her name. A scribe might record the lineage of a king and forget the queen who raised him. A monk copying a manuscript might deem her contributions unimportant. Over time, the absence became normal. Expected. Invisible. And yet, women kept living, working, giving birth, feeding generations, dying without recognition. The foundation of every ancient society rested on their backs, and history looked away. We know this because archaeology tells us what history did not. In graves, we find women buried with combs, beads, tools, and charms. Not royal treasures, but tokens of lives fully lived. In kitchens, we find worn grinding stones that shape daily bread. In ruins, we find loom weights, hairpins, and milk jugs, things held by hands that history did not bother to name. Sometimes we find a name scratched into a pot, or a lullaby sung in a forgotten language, tiny voices barely surviving. A whisper, beneath the roar of battles and politics. And even when remembered, women were often misremembered. The wicked queen, the temptress, the saint, simplified, flattened, made safe or dangerous depending on the needs of the story. Complexity was denied. She could not be all the things she truly was, strong and scared, clever and tired, flawed and brilliant. She had to be one thing, one word, and then fade. This erasure wasn't just accidental. It served a purpose. By forgetting women, history reinforced the idea that men shaped the world and women merely lived in it. That knowledge, invention, leadership, and change came only from one side of humanity. That the rest, the half that bore children, healed wounds, spun thread, told stories, and kept life moving was unworthy of record. And so generation after generation grew up learning only half the story. But absence is not the same as non-existence. The quiet does not mean nothing was there. It means we were not listening. Now, when we study the past, we dig for more than just bones and coins. We dig for her. The girl who ran through olive groves. The mother who whispered prayers over a fevered child. The widow who refused to remarry. The healer with her bundle of herbs. The woman who stood at the edge of society and survived anyway. Her story is still there, beneath the dust. Behind the walls, between the lines of old texts, it is not gone. Just waiting, waiting to be remembered. The silent strength, what they endured. And why it still matters? At the edge of every empire, behind every temple wall, beside every hearth, there were women. They were not the ones with crowns or swords, or ink-stained fingers, but they were there, always there. Building lives out of limits, creating meaning from what little they were allowed to hold. Their stories are hard to find not because they were small, but because they were ignored. Their strength was silent. But it was real. Every ancient woman lived within walls, some made of stone, others made of rules. She obeyed rituals she did not choose. She carried burdens she could not name. She performed roles assigned to her before she was old enough to speak, and yet she persisted, day after day, season after season. She rose before the sun, ground grain between rough stones, fetched water from distant wells, stitched worn tunics. With aching fingers, she whispered songs to restless children. She kissed bruises. She cleaned wounds. She stayed. Her body bore the evidence of a hard life, calloused hands, worn feet, stretched skin. Each mark a record of service, of sacrifice, of strength. Not the kind of strength that marched into battle, but the kind that carries generations. On its back, the quiet endurance of someone who has no choice and still gives everything anyway. And though she had little power in law or land, she shaped the world in other ways, through stories passed from mother to daughter, through wisdom whispered in kitchens and courtyards, through skills honed in silence, spinning, cooking, birthing, through small acts of resistance, a moment of rest when she was told to keep moving, a look that said, "I see you," when others would not speak, a decision to love even in a world that gave her so little love in return. She found strength not because she was given it, but because she made it, pieced it together like a patchwork garment, stitched from scraps of time and breath. And though she was told she was weak, less intelligent, less brave, less human, she knew better. Her survival was proof enough, and yet most of these women never knew they were strong. They were too busy surviving, too busy following rules, raising children, avoiding punishment, or just trying to stay alive. They didn't ask to be remembered, but they deserve to be. Because when we look at the ancient world, what do we truly see? Ruins built by hands, systems enforced by fear, beliefs passed down like heirlooms. But underneath it all, there is another foundation, the invisible labor of women. Without them, empires would not have eaten, cities would not have grown, families would not have endured. They were the soil, the breath, the heartbeat never acknowledged, but always essential. And the legacy of their silence still echoes in how history is written, in who is believed, in who is celebrated. Even now, the traces of their exclusion remain. We still inherit the idea that women's work is less important, that their voices are optional, that strength must look like dominance, and value must look like power. But if we pause and look more closely, we begin to see another truth. Strength doesn't have to shout. It doesn't have to rule. It can exist in the quiet, in care, in endurance, in showing up when no one notices, and doing the work anyway. The ancient woman was told she mattered only if she pleased, obeyed, or reproduced. And yet she mattered anyway. Not because of what men said about her, but because of what she survived. And maybe that is the story we must remember, not of a victim, not of a forgotten shadow, but of a quiet, steady force that kept the world, turning dot in every overlooked potsherd, every smooth floor, every softened garment, every whispered name. She is still there, not screaming, not demanding, just enduring. And that, perhaps more than any crown or victory, was the most remarkable. Thing of all,